Hi there, this is Sagequeen from GameTours.com, and this is part 5 of my Adept guide for Mass Effect 2. In this video, we'll be talking about the basic biotic powers and the strengths and the challenges of each one. Every time that you gain a level in Mass Effect 2, you'll get a couple of skill points to spend on your powers. At the end of the game, you'll have gained 51 skill points, but that won't be enough to get every single power you have access to up to its highest level. The key then to making a good Adept build is knowing where you want to focus your biotic energies and where you feel that you can ignore a particular skill or not spend as many points on it. And I think that making a good Adept build is as much a function of knowing what the powers are and how they work in particular situations as it is knowing your own play preferences and what you most often will be using on the battlefield. But nearly every Adept build you'll see, from Insanity builds on down, are going to agree that one skill you need to pay attention to and learn to love is the skill of Singularity. To put it bluntly, if you don't use Singularity as an Adept, then there's no point in being an Adept. First of all, it's your unique skill, and second of all, it's an awesome skill, so it's one you want to learn how to master. Now, Singularity is essentially a dark energy mass that Shepard can throw out onto the field. It will then stay there as a gravity well, and it will pull all enemies towards it. In Mass Effect 1, you may remember, Singularity had a very wide pull zone, but it only affected enemies upon whom it had been cast. Latecomers could walk right through it. But in Mass Effect 2, that's changed. Now, Singularity is a trap, and it works either as a net dropped down onto a target, or it can be a trap that's sprung when someone gets near it. When unprotected enemies get near a Singularity, they'll go flying, and they're weak to damage at that time. That means if you get unprotected enemies caught in a Singularity, it will drag them up above cover. On higher levels of Singularity, it will keep them trapped above cover. And since your squad mates tend to prefer shooting things that are easy to see, the squaddy AI will naturally target enemies trapped in the Singularity. While I'll talk more about biotic combos later, know that if you throw another skill on top of Singularity, like most often Warp and sometimes Shockwave, it will do double damage to the creature caught in the Singularity, often immediately killing them. But do keep in mind that biotic combos where you're using two biotic powers together will end up canceling each other. So if you throw a Warp on a Singularity, it will immediately collapse the Singularity. One of my personal favorite uses for Singularity is to set it down as a trap on strategic choke points on the battlefield. If there's a particular place where you notice enemies tend to take cover near a wall, or a place where enemies are walking towards you, or a place where enemies are coming down a corridor or through a door, it's fantastic to throw Singularity there. As the enemies enter the battlefield, they get sucked towards the Singularity, giving you time to kill them off before they manage to get better places in the room, or worse yet, flank you. Singularity is also powerful in that it is effective at any range, mid, long, or short. I personally find it's most effective at the mid-range. At point-blank range, it will collapse if Shepard gets near it, and at the long range, you can easily lose track of which targets you're aiming for. So again, I prefer to use it at the mid-range. Since protection types, armor, shields, and barriers, act as gravity regulators, that will keep any protected targets from getting sucked up into the orbit of a Singularity. For that reason, I find Singularities most effective on unprotected targets. But it still has an application for protected ones. Protected targets will have to fight the gravity well's pull, thus causing them to struggle, and it will frequently keep them busy, pinned in place, and they will not be able to fight very well. In certain situations, this can help you live. It can help you tie up boss mobs who are trying to reach you, and so on, to keep people from flanking you. But this struggle will collapse the Singularity faster than normal, with bigger targets breaking free more easily. Getting Singularity leveled up to level 4 will allow you to either choose Heavy Singularity, which will hold protected targets longer, or Wide Singularity, which will capture more unprotected targets in its wake. As awesome as Singularity is, however, it does have a few challenges. The first, of course, is that Singularity is most effective on unprotected targets, and on protected targets, your constant game will be getting protections off so that you can suck enemies into Singularity's orbit. At the low levels, levels 1 and 2, Singularity can't pull enemies out from behind cover, and it's rather ineffective at keeping enemies trapped within it. In fact, it acts sort of like pull with a bad left turn in that it will bring people in and then pop them back out, sometimes to drop right at your feet. Leveling Singularity will widen its pull and keep enemies trapped longer and more effectively, but at low levels, I find Singularity feels a little bit broken, and some people have complained about this, saying that the Adept has a very steep learning curve as a result. Also, I find that Singularity is a little tricky to get the targeting right on it. Because of the way that it glows, it's very easy for Singularity to look like it's on top of a target when actually it's significantly in front of a target. It creates a bit of an optical illusion there. If you use the auto-targeting system, I use a PC, you'll notice that the little red arrows will click in on the target saying that it's locked. But even if a target is locked, if the enemy AI causes the enemy to dodge around cover, the computer can get confused and toss that Singularity into a wall, even though the computer just said it had locked onto your target. I find that I'm often much better off using my quick keys to target Singularity where I think the creature will be, or slightly to the side of it. But sometimes I have a moment of stupidity, and I'm not much better at aiming than the computer is. Two final notes: Singularity has a recharge timer of 4.5 seconds, meaning that once you cast it, you can't use another skill until 4.5 seconds have passed. That makes it right around the mid-range for recharging in terms of the Adept skills. Also, you can only have one Singularity active on the field at a time. If you cast a new one, the old one will disappear on you. The exception to that is that both Shepard and Liara can have Singularities going at the same time in Lair the Shadow Broker. The Adept skill of Warp is a popular one. It's one of my personal favorites. I think of it as this glorious hammer of the gods that smacks down a dark energy missile on your target. It's most effective on barriers and armor, useful against health, and it's very effective on weightless targets affected by other biotic powers, most significantly Singularity. As I've said before, busting through enemy protections is one of those things that you do a lot as an Adept, and since Warp will take care of armor and barriers, that means that 2 out of your 3 problems for protections are taken care of by this one skill. Warp is effective at mid, short, or even the very long range. It also disorients the target momentarily, allowing you to get a few extra bullets in. I find it's very nice to have on hand in case you run out of ammo, and I often toss it off whenever I go to reload just for extra measure. It's often my last shot fired in a battle. Like Singularity, one of the challenges with Warp is learning how to target it effectively. For some reason, I find Warp is easier to aim than Singularity, maybe because it doesn't have that optical illusion, so it's a lot easier to see where you're throwing. Now, for all of Shepard's skills, they will be fired in the direction that the crosshairs are pointing, whether that's auto-targeting or whether that is your own quick keys. With practice, you can get your skills, particularly Warp, to round cover and tag enemies where they're hiding. Note that squad mates with the same skills will simply shoot them in a straight line from where they are to where the enemy is, without that same ability to round cover. So one challenge of Warp is learning to target it most effectively. The other challenge is that it's not especially effective against shields, but really no biotic powers are. The last downside of Warp is that it has a long recharge timer of 6 seconds, and there are some people who don't use Warp much, if at all, because of that reason. Now, as for myself, I'll be honest with you, I got through a veteran, a hardcore, and an insanity run as an Adept, and I never noticed the recharge timer at all. I typically let loose with a rain of bullets as soon as I'm done casting off a skill, and I often use a lot of combos with my squad mates who have much slower recharge timers than Shepard does. So again, honestly, I didn't even notice it. But if you do notice it, and for that reason Warp is annoying to you, that may be a reason to consider putting your skill points into something else. Warp either evolves into Heavy Warp, which does more damage, especially at the higher difficulties, that's nice, or Unstable Warp, which can target more enemies. As I mentioned in a previous video, Biotics is basically telekinesis, and what would telekinesis be without the ability to throw your enemy across the room? The skill of Throw does some damage against protected targets, but because it is a gravity regulating skill, will do the most damage against unprotected ones. That's a big change from Mass Effect 1, in which Throw could toss anyone, shields and all. Now, unless you bust through enemy protection, it won't move them. Throw tosses an unprotected enemy away from you, doing some damage if you throw them across a flat surface, but the most damage if you can throw them up against something, or better yet, off of something like a nice friendly cliff. Now, husks, which are a very annoying baddie in my particular opinion, will die the moment their feet leave the ground. That's a little odd to me, but it does mean that Throw is highly effective against husks if you can get them unprotected. But the challenges of Throw are that first, again, you can't move the target unless their protections are gone, and on harder difficulties that means that you have to get through protection first, making Throw a little bit less effective for you. And again, Throw is a rather terrain-dependent skill. It is most effective when you can toss enemies right off of something. I also find that I have an easier time using Throw for Shepard. Again, Shepard's skill goes right in the direction of that crosshair, so I can usually keep track of if I'm aiming the baddie correctly. But again, with squad mates, they go from where they're standing to the target, and in heated battles, you can sometimes lose track of where your squad mates are standing precisely. I'm not always sure, for example, if Samara is going to throw that enemy off a cliff, or if she's going to throw it right at my feet. Throw is one of the shortest recharge timers in the game at only 3 seconds, however. It levels up into either Heavy Throw, which crushes powerful force against the enemy, very useful on harder difficulties, or a Throw Field, which will toss multiple unprotected enemies away from you at once. For myself personally, while I find Throw has very specific applications, I know there's some battles where I don't use it much at all, but other battles where I'm using it all the time. Like Throw, Pull is a skill that does some damage on protected targets, but is most often used against unprotected ones. Now, back in Mass Effect 1, the Adept had the skill of Lift that bypassed shields and lifted them up in the air, and they would often get stuck in the ceiling or never come down again. And I assume that the craziness on the game engine was probably the reason behind changing that skill to Pull. Now, Pull biotically grabs a target and drags them in towards you. They're totally helpless as they come. You can detonate a warp on them as they're on their way. You can mow them down with bullets as they're coming towards you. And if you plan things right with the terrain, you can even yank them right off a ledge to land in a chasm. That one's always fun. And again, because husks will die the moment their feet leave the ground, Pull is a very effective skill to use on unprotected husks. Just be sure not to grab an abomination in the mix, because abominations will explode if they get near you. Note that if you pull enemies into obstacles, they will get stuck on those things and flail helplessly where they ran into them. Another particular use of Pull is that you can use it on heavy mechs. Heavy mechs have a lot of protections, but if you can get through the shielding and the armor on them, which is a feat in and of itself, if you toss Pull on them when they have just their red health bar, it will cause them to flail helplessly. They won't actually come off the ground because they're too heavy, but it will allow you to mow them down with bullets while they're immobilized. The challenges with Pull are that, of course, first, you have to get through enemy protections to make people actually come flying, and secondly, once you get through those protections, some people would not prefer to have their enemies come in close where they're going to pop back up and potentially shoot them in the face. If you're like me and you prefer a mid-range style of gaming for the Adept, you're going to want to use a skill like Singularity instead, where you can keep your enemies out on the battlefield rather than up in your face. Also, like Throw, Pull is a somewhat terrain-dependent skill in that it does its best damage if you can yank someone off a cliff and thus do an insta-kill with it. Pull, like Throw, has a recharge timer of only 3 seconds, and like Throw, it can either evolve into Heavy Pull, which lasts longer, or into Pull Field, which will drag multiple unprotected enemies towards you at once. Alright, now the last skill is Shockwave. Shockwave will send a freight train of biotic damage down the deck away from Shepard. If the Shockwave hits a protected target, it will harm their protections, and then it will also stun them. If it hits an unprotected target, however, it will do damage and knock them aside. Now, while Shepard can hide behind cover and not be hurt by the Scion's version of Shockwave, the same is not true for enemies. Shepard's version of Shockwave will tear through everything, including obstacles. Shockwave has a rather long recharge timer of 6 seconds. When it's fully leveled, it can either become Heavy Shockwave, which does more damage, or it can become a wider Shockwave that will take out more of an area in front of it. Shockwave can be a lot of fun in terms of creating a lot of chaos and carnage, and people who like to go bowling for enemies will really enjoy this skill. One of the challenges with Shockwave, though, is that it requires a double unlock, and by that I mean you have to get Singularity up to level 2, which isn't a big problem because you probably want to level it to level 4 anyways, but then you have to get Pull up to level 2, and only then can you go on to putting a point or two into Shockwave. People who are not particularly committed to Pull, and there are some who are not big fans of that particular skill, will simply find themselves never even unlocking Shockwave to drop a point into it. The other challenges with Shockwave are that it doesn't do a great deal of damage, certainly not as much as a skill like Warp, and that it isn't quite as precise in moving your enemies around the battlefield as a skill like Singularity is, where it's going to pin them in place, or Throw or Pull are, where they're going to bring them in very neat straight lines to you or away from you. Alright, so that's it for your basic powers. The next 2 videos we'll be talking about the last 2 bars that you'll see on the character screen there. First we'll be talking about bonus powers and which ones the Adepts most often take to round out their skill set, and then we'll be talking about the Biotic Mastery and whether you might want to go Bastion or Nemesis. From Game Tours, this is Sagequeen. Happy hunting!